The last time anyone saw her alive, she was walking toward a blue pickup truck in the parking lot of the Maple Grove Baptist Church. That was October 17th, 2003. She was 17 years old, wearing a yellow sundress her grandmother had made for her birthday, and she had exactly $4.37 in her pocket. I know these details because I've spent 20 years memorizing every single one of them. Because that girl, that was my sister. And for 2 decades, I've been hunting the person who took her from us. Now, before I take you deeper into this nightmare, I need you to do something for me. If you've ever lost someone, if you've ever looked into the eyes of evil without knowing it, if you believe that justice should never have an expiration date, then share this video right now. Subscribe to this channel. Because stories like my sister's, they get forgotten. They get filed away in dusty boxes in the back rooms of police stations. And the monsters who commit these crimes, they count on us forgetting. They count on us scrolling past. Don't give them that satisfaction. Share this, subscribe, and stay with me until the very end, because what happened in that small Tennessee town will shake you to your core. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I grew up in Hawkins Creek, Tennessee. Population 3,247. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where doors stayed unlocked, and where the biggest crime most folks could remember was Tommy Patterson stealing lawn ornaments after prom night in 1998. We were naive. We were trusting. And that trust, it would cost us everything. My sister's name was Sarah. Sarah Elizabeth Mercer. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel seen. You know the type, the girl who remembered everyone's birthday, who left little notes in your locker just to make you smile, who spent her summers volunteering at the animal shelter because she couldn't stand the thought of any creature feeling alone. She wanted to be a veterinarian. She'd already been accepted early to the University of Tennessee. Our parents had saved for years to make that dream possible. October 17th, 2003 was a Friday. I remember because I was supposed to pick Sarah up from choir practice at the church. Our mom had asked me at breakfast, and I'd said, yes, sure, no problem. But then my buddy Jake called and said he had tickets to see a band in Nashville. And I thought, what's the big deal? Sarah can get a ride with someone else. She always does. That decision has haunted me every single day for 20 years. When Sarah didn't come home by 7 o'clock, my mother started calling around. By 8, she was frantic. By 9, my father was driving through town, checking every parking lot, every friend's house, every place a teenage girl might wander. By midnight, we'd called the police. Deputy Frank Morrison took the report. I remember him sitting at our kitchen table, his hat in his hands, telling my parents that teenagers run off sometimes, that she'd probably had a fight with a boyfriend we didn't know about, that she'd be back by morning with a story about staying at a friend's house and forgetting to call. But I saw something in his eyes that night, something he was trying to hide, a flicker of something darker than mere teenage rebellion. Looking back, I wonder what he already knew. I wonder what secrets were already circulating through the whispered conversations of Hawkins Creek's inner circle. By Sunday morning, when Sarah still hadn't come home, when none of her friends had seen her, when her cell phone went straight to voicemail, the search began in earnest. Volunteers gathered at the church parking lot, the same spot where she'd last been seen. They spread out through the woods surrounding our town, calling her name, praying for a miracle. I was 19 years old that October. I was supposed to be invincible, immortal, untouchable by tragedy. Instead, I found myself walking through those Tennessee woods, screaming my sister's name until my voice gave out, bargaining with God for just one more chance to tell her I was sorry for not picking her up, for choosing a concert over her. The search went on for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of hope slowly draining away, replaced by a dread so heavy it felt like drowning. And then on November 8th, 2003, a hunter named Gerald Patterson found something in a ravine about 12 miles outside of town. He found my sister. I won't describe what he found. I won't put those images in your head the way they've been seared into mine. What I'll tell you is that Sarah hadn't run away. Sarah hadn't gone off with some secret boyfriend. Sarah had been murdered, strangled, left in that ravine like she was nothing. Like her dreams and her kindness and her beautiful life meant absolutely nothing at all. The investigation that followed was, looking back on it now, a masterclass in failure. Or maybe something worse. Maybe it was a masterclass in misdirection. Detective Harold Webb led the case, and he had a suspect within 48 hours of finding Sarah's body. A drifter named Carl Jennings, who'd been passing through town, who'd been seen at the diner the morning Sarah disappeared, who had a record that included assault charges from 3 different states. Carl Jennings was arrested on November 15th, 2003. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster had been caught. Justice would be served. My parents could begin the impossible process of grieving, of finding some way to keep living when part of their hearts had been buried with their daughter. But something wasn't right. I visited Carl Jennings in the county jail 2 days after his arrest. I had to look into the eyes of the man who'd killed my sister. I had to understand how someone could do something so evil. And when I sat across from him in that visitor's room, when I looked into his bloodshot, terrified eyes, he said something I would never forget. He said, "I didn't do this, kid. And somewhere in this town, the real killer is sleeping just fine tonight." The trial of Carl Jennings began on March 3rd, 2004, and the whole town turned out to watch. The courthouse in Hawkins Creek was a beautiful old building, white columns and red brick, the kind of place that made you believe in the dignity of the law. That spring, it felt more like a coliseum where the community had gathered to watch a man be fed to lions. I sat in the 3rd row every single day of that trial. My mother sat beside me, clutching a photograph of Sarah in her trembling hands. My father couldn't bring himself to come. He'd started drinking by then, heavily, trying to drown the grief in whiskey and silence. It would kill him within 5 years, that drinking. Another casualty of what happened to Sarah, another life that monster in the ravine had destroyed. The prosecution's case seemed solid. Carl Jennings had been in town. He had no alibi for the afternoon Sarah disappeared. His truck matched the description of the vehicle seen in the church parking lot. And most damning of all, they'd found a yellow thread on his jacket. A thread that the crime lab said was consistent with the fabric of Sarah's sundress. That thread, that single yellow thread, it would haunt me for 2 decades. Carl Jennings took the stand in his own defense, against the advice of his court-appointed attorney. He was not a sympathetic figure. He was rough-looking, poorly spoken, with a lifetime of bad decisions written in the lines of his weathered face. But I watched him carefully as he testified, watched his eyes, listened to the desperation in his voice, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching a man telling the truth. He said he'd been in town to visit his cousin, a woman named Beatrice, who lived on Miller Road. He said he'd left Hawkins Creek by noon on October 17th, hours before Sarah disappeared. He said he'd stopped at a gas station in Clarksville at 2:47 p.m., a full hour before the time Sarah was last seen. He begged the jury to check the gas station's records, to look at the security footage, to verify his story. The prosecutor dismissed these claims as desperate fabrications. The gas station, he said, had no record of the transaction. The security footage from that day had been recorded over. Beatrice had refused to testify on her cousin's behalf, claiming she'd been asleep during his visit and couldn't confirm when he'd arrived or left. I remember the moment the verdict was read. Guilty of murder in the first degree. My mother collapsed against me, sobbing. The gallery erupted in applause, and Carl Jennings, that broken man in the orange jumpsuit, turned and looked directly at me with an expression I will never forget. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't anger, it was pity. He pitied me. That look stayed with me as the months turned into years. It stayed with me as I tried to rebuild my life, as I graduated from community college and became a private investigator, because I couldn't shake the need to understand what had happened to my sister. It stayed with me through my mother's funeral in 2011, through my own failed marriage in 2015, through all the sleepless nights when I would lie awake and hear Sarah's voice in my memory, asking me why I hadn't picked her up from choir practice. And it stayed with me every time I pulled out the case file I'd secretly copied from the county records office and spread the papers across my kitchen table, looking for the thing I knew I was missing, because something wasn't right. The more I studied the case, the more wrong it felt. The yellow thread on Carl's jacket bothered me. The prosecution had made it sound so definitive. But when I dug into the trial transcripts, I realized the crime lab had only said the thread was consistent with Sarah's dress, not a match, consistent with. That kind of fabric was sold in dozens of stores across Tennessee. Thousands of garments could have produced a similar thread. Then there was the matter of the blue pickup truck. 3 witnesses had seen Sarah walking toward it in the church parking lot. But Carl Jennings drove a brown pickup, not blue. The prosecution had argued that the witnesses were simply mistaken about the color, that memories were unreliable, that the lighting in the parking lot had been poor. The jury had accepted this explanation, but I'd gone back to that parking lot. I'd stood there at the same time of day in the same month, under similar weather conditions. The lighting wasn't poor at all. Then the sun didn't set until after 6 p.m. in October. Sarah had been seen at 4:30. The parking lot was fully illuminated. Those witnesses knew what they saw. They saw a blue truck, and Carl Jennings didn't own one. The third thing that bothered me was Beatrice, Carl's cousin. Why had she refused to testify? If she couldn't confirm Carl's alibi, why not just say so? Her absence from the trial felt deliberate, calculated. When I finally tracked her down in 2012, 8 years after the conviction, she was living in a nursing home in Memphis, her mind ravaged by dementia. She didn't remember Carl. She didn't remember the trial. She didn't remember anything. But her daughter remembered plenty. Beatrice's daughter, a woman named Louise, told me that her mother had wanted to testify. She said Beatrice had clear memories of Carl's visit, had written them down in a journal, had been prepared to provide a detailed account of his arrival time and departure. But someone had convinced her not to take the stand. Someone had visited her 3 days before the trial and told her that testifying would be a mistake, that her own past would be dragged into court, that secrets she'd kept buried would be exposed. I asked Louise who had visited her mother. She said it was a man in a uniform, a man everyone in town trusted, a man whose word was law. Deputy Frank Morrison. I spent the next 6 years investigating Deputy Frank Morrison, and what I found shattered everything I thought I knew about Hawkins Creek. The man who had taken the initial report about my sister's disappearance, who had sat at my family's kitchen table with his hat in his hands, who had patted my mother's shoulder and promised we'd find Sarah safe and sound. That man was not who he appeared to be. Frank Morrison had been a fixture in Hawkins Creek for as long as anyone could remember. He'd grown up there, played football for the high school team, married his high school sweetheart, and joined the sheriff's department at 22. By 2003, he was 41 years old and the most respected law enforcement officer in the county. People called him Saint Frank because of his volunteer work with at-risk youth, his Sunday school teaching at Maple Grove Baptist, his tireless dedication to keeping the community safe. But I discovered that Frank Morrison had another side, a side that he kept hidden behind that badge and that easy smile. In 2007, a woman named Rebecca Torres filed a complaint against Morrison, alleging that he had sexually harassed her during a traffic stop. The complaint was quickly dismissed. Rebecca had a prior arrest for drug possession, and the sheriff's department claimed she was trying to get revenge for that arrest. Rebecca moved away from Hawkins Creek shortly afterward. When I finally tracked her down in 2014, she was living in Oregon and terrified to speak with me. It took 3 visits before she trusted me enough to tell the truth. She said Frank Morrison hadn't just harassed her. She said he'd assaulted her. She said he'd threatened to destroy her life if she ever told anyone. Said he had connections that reached all the way to the state capitol. Said he could make people disappear. Make people disappear. Those words echoed in my head as I drove back to Tennessee. I thought about Sarah, about her yellow dress, about that blue pickup truck. And I started digging into Frank Morrison's life with renewed determination. What I found was a pattern. Between 1995 and 2003, 4 young women had disappeared from the counties surrounding Hawkins Creek. 3 of them were eventually found dead, their bodies discovered in remote locations, their deaths attributed to transient criminals or unknown assailants. 1 was never found at all. None of these cases were ever conclusively solved. And in each case, Frank Morrison had some connection. He'd assisted with the investigation, or he'd known the victim through his volunteer work, or he'd been seen in the area around the time of the disappearance. Coincidence? Perhaps. But as any investigator knows, there's no such thing as coincidence. There's only patterns we haven't yet understood. By 2018, I had compiled a file on Frank Morrison that was 3 inches thick. I had witness statements, financial records, phone logs, and dozens of photographs. I had evidence that suggested Morrison had been living far beyond his means, that he'd made cash deposits to an offshore account, that he'd traveled to the Caribbean twice a year, despite earning a deputy's salary. But I didn't have proof. Not the kind that would stand up in court. Not the kind that would convince a prosecutor to reopen a closed case and arrest the most beloved lawman in the county. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever looked at someone you trusted, someone you admired and wondered what they might be hiding? Have you ever questioned whether the people who claim to protect us might actually be the ones we should fear most? Leave a comment below and tell me what you think. Because as this story unfolds, you'll see just how dangerous misplaced trust can be. The breakthrough came in January 2019, when I received an anonymous letter in my mailbox. There was no return address, no signature, just a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. The gas station footage still exists. Check the archives at Cumberland County Storage Facility, Unit 247. The truth has been waiting for you. I drove to Cumberland County that very night. The storage facility was one of those massive warehouse operations, rows and rows of orange doors under flickering fluorescent lights. Unit 247 was registered to an LLC that traced back to a man named Gerald Patterson, the same hunter who had found my sister's body in that ravine. I picked the lock. I know I shouldn't have, but after 16 years of searching for answers, I was past caring about legal niceties. The unit was mostly empty, just a few cardboard boxes stacked against the back wall. But inside those boxes, I found something that would change everything. VHS tapes, dozens of them, labeled with dates and locations, and one of them was labeled Clarksville Gas Station, October 17th, 2003. My hands were shaking as I drove home with that tape. I had to borrow a VCR from my neighbor, because who owns one anymore? And when I finally managed to get it working, when I finally saw what was on that footage, I understood why someone had worked so hard to bury it. The tape showed Carl Jennings walking into the gas station at 2:46 p.m. on October 17th, 2003. Clear as day, unmistakable. He was alive, he was in Clarksville, and he was nowhere near the church parking lot where my sister was last seen. Carl Jennings was innocent. He'd spent 15 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And somewhere out there, the real killer was still free. The morning after I watched that tape, I went to see Carl Jennings. He was still incarcerated at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, a broken man whose health had deteriorated dramatically during his years behind bars. When they brought him into the visitor's room, I barely recognized him. His hair had gone completely white. His hands trembled constantly. His eyes, once so desperately pleading, had taken on the hollow look of someone who had given up hope long ago. But when I told him what I'd found, when I showed him photographs of the tape and its label, something in those hollow eyes flickered back to life. He said, I told everyone who would listen. That tape existed. It always existed, but nobody believed me. Nobody wanted to believe me. I asked him what he meant. Who hadn't wanted to believe him? He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. He said that during his trial, his court-appointed attorney had discovered the gas station footage. The attorney, a young man named Thomas Reed, had been excited, triumphant even. He told Carl that the footage would prove his innocence, that the prosecution's case would collapse, that Carl would be a free man within weeks. But the day before Thomas Reed was supposed to submit the footage as evidence, something happened. Reed came to visit Carl in the county jail, and he was a different person. Pale, trembling, unable to meet Carl's eyes. He said the footage had been misplaced. He said the gas station had no record of it. He said Carl would have to rely on other evidence. Carl had begged him, pleaded with him, demanded to know what had happened. And Thomas Reed, just before he left, had whispered 5 words that Carl never forgot. they'll kill my family, Carl." A week later, Thomas Reed resigned from the public defender's office. He moved to Montana, changed his name, and never practiced law again. I tracked him down in 2019, living in a cabin in the mountains outside of Missoula. He was dying of cancer, and he had nothing left to lose. He told me everything. The night before he was supposed to submit the gas station footage, he'd received a visitor at his home. Deputy Frank Morrison and another man, someone Thomas didn't recognize. Someone with cold eyes and an expensive suit. They'd made it clear that the footage would never be entered into evidence. They'd made it clear that Thomas's wife and 2 young daughters would suffer unimaginable consequences if he didn't comply. And they'd made it clear that this was just the beginning, that Thomas would resign, leave Tennessee, and never speak of what he knew. Thomas Reed had spent 15 years drowning in guilt. He tried to drink himself to death, tried to escape into work, tried to convince himself that he'd had no choice. But lying there in his cabin, his body failing, he needed absolution. He gave me names. He gave me dates. He gave me the outline of a conspiracy that stretched far beyond Frank Morrison, far beyond Hawkins Creek, into the highest levels of Tennessee law enforcement. What I learned was this: Frank Morrison wasn't acting alone. He was part of a network, a group of men in positions of power who had been covering for each other's crimes for decades. Judges, prosecutors, police officers, wealthy businessmen, they called themselves the Covenant, and they operated with absolute impunity. They shared information, shared resources, and when one of them crossed a line that couldn't be ignored, the others made sure the evidence disappeared, and someone else took the fall. My sister had stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to see. In the weeks before her death, she'd been volunteering at the church, helping with administrative work. She'd had access to files, to records, to documentation of donations and expenditures, and she'd found something wrong. Money that didn't add up. Payments to organizations that didn't exist. A paper trail that led somewhere dangerous. Sarah, my beautiful, idealistic sister, had done exactly what I would have expected her to do. She'd started asking questions. She'd talked to someone she trusted, someone in a position of authority, someone who she thought would know what to do. She'd talked to Deputy Frank Morrison, and Frank Morrison had silenced her forever. The realization of what had happened, the full scope of it, hit me like a physical blow. For 16 years, I'd been searching for a faceless monster, some unknown evil that had stolen my sister from the world. But the monster had a face. The monster had sat at our kitchen table. The monster had looked into my mother's eyes and promised to find her daughter. I wanted to go to the police immediately. I wanted to find Frank Morrison and make him pay for what he'd done. But Thomas Reed, even as he lay dying, warned me to be careful. The Covenant was still active, still powerful. They had eyes everywhere. If I moved too quickly, if I tipped my hand, I would disappear just like my sister had. I needed more evidence. I needed to build a case so overwhelming that not even the Covenant could make it disappear. And I needed allies, people outside of Tennessee, people who couldn't be bought or threatened or silenced. I found them in the FBI. Special Agent Maria Santos was the first person in law enforcement to take me seriously. She was with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, specializing in cases involving law enforcement corruption. When I walked into her office in Nashville with my box of evidence, she could have dismissed me as a conspiracy theorist, another grieving family member unable to accept the official story. Instead, she listened. She asked questions. And when I showed her the gas station footage, she looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. She said, "Someone went to extraordinary lengths to bury this. Let's find out why." For the next 2 years, Agent Santos and I worked together to build a case against Frank Morrison and the Covenant. It was dangerous work, conducted in secret, with constant fear that we'd be discovered. I changed apartments 3 times. I bought a gun and learned to use it. I developed a level of paranoia that my therapist would later tell me bordered on the clinical. But the evidence mounted. We found financial records showing that Morrison had received over $200,000 in untraceable payments between 1998 and 2005. We found testimony from other women who had been victimized by him, women who had been too frightened to come forward before, but who were willing to speak now that the FBI was involved. We found connections between Morrison and 3 other unsolved murders, patterns that had been deliberately obscured by sloppy police work and missing evidence. And we found Gerald Patterson, the hunter who had discovered my sister's body. Gerald was dying too. Like so many of the people in this story, he had terminal lung cancer and he was living in a hospice facility in Knoxville. When I visited him, he was barely conscious, drifting in and out of awareness. But in his lucid moments, he told me something that made my blood run cold. He said he hadn't stumbled upon Sarah's body by accident. He said he'd been told exactly where to find her. Deputy Frank Morrison had come to his house the night before and shown him a map with the location marked. Morrison had said it was an anonymous tip, that he needed a civilian to discover the body to protect the ongoing investigation. Gerald, trusting and loyal, had done exactly what Morrison asked. But Gerald had suspected the truth for years. He'd kept those VHS tapes, evidence from various cases that Morrison had asked him to dispose of, hidden away, a form of insurance in case Morrison ever turned on him. When Gerald realized he was dying, he'd sent me that anonymous letter. He wanted the truth to come out. He wanted to make amends for his silence. By 2021, Agent Santos had enough evidence to present to a federal grand jury. The indictments were sealed to prevent the targets from fleeing, and the FBI began coordinating a massive operation to arrest Morrison and several other members of the Covenant simultaneously. But 2 days before the arrests were scheduled, something happened that nearly destroyed everything. Someone leaked information about the investigation. Morrison was warned. He disappeared from Hawkins Creek in the middle of the night, leaving behind a house stripped of any incriminating evidence. The FBI searched for him for 3 months, following leads that went cold, tracking rumors that led nowhere. I thought we'd lost. I thought Morrison would vanish forever, would spend his remaining years on some beach in a country with no extradition treaty, laughing at the justice he'd evaded. The despair I felt during those months was overwhelming. I'd come so close, been so certain that we would finally have answers, and now it was slipping away. And then, in June 2022, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was from a woman named Karen Mitchell, and she said she was Frank Morrison's daughter. She said she'd been watching the news, following the investigation, piecing together the truth about her father. She said she knew where he was hiding, and she said she wanted to help me bring him to justice. Karen Mitchell was 43 years old, a school teacher in Memphis who had spent her entire life believing her father was a hero. The revelation of what he truly was had shattered her. sent her into a spiral of shame and grief and rage. She'd wrestled with her loyalty to him, the love she still felt despite everything, the memories of the man who had taught her to ride a bicycle and walked her down the aisle at her wedding. But she couldn't stay silent, not anymore. She told me that her father was hiding in a cabin in the Smoky Mountains, a property that had belonged to her grandfather and wasn't in any official records. He'd been there for months, surviving on supplies Karen brought him, living like a hermit while the investigation raged on without him. He believed he was safe there, believed that time would eventually make the whole thing blow over. I asked Karen why she was telling me this. Why betray her own father? She said she'd spent weeks reading the evidence, the testimony, the documentation of her father's crimes. She'd seen the photographs of the victims, including my sister. She'd read Sarah's diary entries, the ones we'd recovered from her bedroom, full of hope and dreams and plans for a future she would never have. And Karen had realized that her father's freedom had been purchased with the lives of innocent girls. She said, "My father is a monster, and I won't protect monsters, not even the ones I love." We coordinated with Agent Santos. The FBI assembled a team for the arrest, chosen carefully for their integrity and their distance from any Tennessee law enforcement connections. On July 14th, 2022, they surrounded the cabin in the Smokies. Frank Morrison came out without a fight. He was 60 years old, gray and weathered, diminished somehow from the imposing figure I remembered from my childhood. When they put him in handcuffs, he looked around at the federal agents, at the news helicopter circling overhead, and his eyes finally landed on me. I was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching justice finally arrive after 19 years. He smiled at me, a cold, empty smile that made my skin crawl. He said, "You think this is over, Daniel? You think arresting me changes anything? The covenant has roots deeper than you can imagine. Cut off one head and two more grow back." But I could see the fear behind his bravado. He knew his days of impunity were finished. He knew the evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning, the paper trail undeniable. For the first time in his life, Frank Morrison was facing consequences. The trial began in February 2023, 20 years after my sister's murder. It was held in federal court in Nashville, far from the jurisdiction where Morrison had wielded his influence. The prosecution presented a case that was meticulous, comprehensive, and devastating. Witness after witness took the stand, painting a portrait of a man who had used his badge as a license for predation, who had hidden behind the trust of his community while destroying lives. I testified for 3 days. I told the jury about my sister, about the night she disappeared, about the 20 years I'd spent searching for answers. I told them about Carl Jennings, about Thomas Reed, about all the people whose lives had been destroyed by Morrison's crimes and the conspiracy that protected him. And then Karen Mitchell took the stand. She testified against her own father, providing details about his methods, his contacts, his hiding places. She produced documents she'd found in her parents' attic, records of payments and meetings that Morrison had thought were safely hidden. She looked at her father across the courtroom, and I saw tears streaming down her face, but her voice never wavered. After her testimony, Morrison's defense team tried to plea bargain. The judge refused. The evidence was too overwhelming, the crimes too heinous. This case would be decided by a jury. The deliberations lasted 4 days. 4 days of waiting, of pacing, of staring at my phone and willing it to ring. 20 years of searching, of hoping, of refusing to give up, all coming down to the decision of 12 strangers in a courthouse in Nashville. On March 17th, 2023, exactly 1 week before what would have been my sister's 37th birthday, the verdict came in. Guilty on all counts. Murder in the first degree, obstruction of justice, civil rights violations, conspiracy, witness tampering, 13 separate charges, and the jury had convicted Frank Morrison on every single one. When the foreman read the verdict, I collapsed in my seat. The tears came then, tears I'd been holding back for 2 decades, tears of grief and relief, and something that might have been joy. Around me, the courtroom erupted, but I barely heard any of it. I was thinking about Sarah, about her yellow dress, about the blue pickup truck in the church parking lot, about all the years she should have had, the life she should have lived. I was thinking about how I'd finally kept my promise to find the truth. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later. The courtroom was packed with survivors, family members of victims, journalists from around the country. Frank Morrison sat at the defense table in his orange jumpsuit, looking small and defeated, stripped of the uniform and the authority that had protected him for so long. The families of his victims were allowed to make impact statements. One by one, they approached the podium and spoke about the people they had lost. Mothers who would never see their daughters graduate from college. Fathers who would never walk their girls down the aisle. Siblings who would never again hear a voice that had been silenced too soon. When it was my turn, I stood at that podium and looked directly at Frank Morrison. I told him about Sarah, about her laugh, which sounded like wind chimes on a summer evening, about her handwriting, small and precise, filling journal after journal with her thoughts and dreams, about the veterinary practice she would have opened, the animals she would have saved, the lives she would have touched. I told him about my parents, how their grief had consumed them, how my father had drunk himself to death and my mother had died of a broken heart. I told him about my own life, the relationships I'd destroyed, because I couldn't let go of the past, the nightmares that still woke me in the middle of the night. And then I told him that despite everything he had taken from us, he had failed. Because Sarah's memory lived on, because the truth had finally come out, because justice, however delayed, had been served. The judge sentenced Frank Morrison to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led him away, he turned and looked at me one final time. There was no smile now, no bravado. Just the hollow eyes of a man who would spend his remaining years in a cell, stripped of everything he had valued. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. No punishment could bring Sarah back or undo the damage that had been done. But it was something. It was accountability. It was acknowledgement that her life had mattered, that her death had not been forgotten. After the sentencing, I visited Carl Jennings. He had been released from prison 3 months earlier, after 19 years of wrongful incarceration. The state of Tennessee had issued him a formal apology and a compensation payment that seemed laughably inadequate for nearly 2 decades of stolen life. He was living with his niece in a small apartment in Chattanooga, trying to rebuild an existence that had been shattered before it could truly begin. He looked better than when I'd last seen him. His eyes had life in them again. His hands had stopped trembling. But there was a sadness in him that I recognized, a weight that would never fully lift. I apologized to him for doubting him at first, for not fighting harder for the truth, for taking so long to find the answers that should have been apparent from the beginning. He shook his head and took my hand. He said, "You never gave up. Everyone else did, but you kept looking. That's all that matters." We sat together for hours, two men bound by tragedy, sharing stories about the years we'd lost and the futures we still hope to build. Before I left, Carl made me promise something. He said that Sarah's story should be told, not just as a tale of crime and punishment, but as a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of questioning authority, the necessity of fighting for truth, even when the odds seem impossible. I promised him I would tell that story, and now, here it is. In the months following the trial, the investigation expanded. Agent Santos and her team dismantled the Covenant, arresting 14 additional members on charges ranging from obstruction to conspiracy to murder. Judges who had fixed cases, prosecutors who had buried evidence, police officers who had intimidated witnesses, all of them finally faced accountability for their crimes. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Over 30 years, the Covenant had protected at least a dozen murderers, rapists, and violent criminals. They had destroyed evidence in hundreds of cases. They had ruined the lives of anyone who dared to challenge their authority. And they had done it all while wearing badges and sitting in courtrooms, while the communities they served trusted them with their safety. The exposure of the Covenant led to a complete restructuring of law enforcement in several Tennessee counties. New oversight procedures were implemented. Civilian review boards were established. Training programs were developed to identify and prevent corruption before it could take root. None of this would bring back the victims. None of it could undo the decades of injustice. But it would make it harder for the next Frank Morrison to hide in plain sight, to use authority as a weapon to destroy lives with impunity. And that, I think, is what Sarah would have wanted. Not vengeance, but prevention. Not hatred, but healing. She was always thinking about the future, about making the world better for those who would come after her. In death, she had finally accomplished that goal. It's been a year now since Frank Morrison was sentenced to prison, and I'm sitting on the porch of the house where Sarah and I grew up. The new owners let me visit sometimes, let me walk through the rooms where my sister laughed and dreamed and lived. They understand what this place means to me, what it represents. I come here to remember, and I come here to say goodbye. For 20 years, my life was defined by Sarah's absence, by the need to find answers, by the consuming fire of grief and determination. Now that the fire has burned out, I'm left with something I didn't expect. Peace. Not happiness exactly. The scars are too deep for that. But a sense of completion, of resolution, of finally being able to put down the burden I've carried for so long. Karen Mitchell and I have become unlikely friends. She carries her own guilt, her own grief, her own complex relationship with a father who was simultaneously her hero and her horror. We meet for coffee sometimes, two people trying to make sense of the unthinkable. She started a foundation in Sarah's name, providing resources for families of missing persons, advocating for criminal justice reform. It's her way of atoning for sins she didn't commit but feels responsible for anyway. Carl Jennings passed away last month, peacefully in his sleep. He was 73 years old, and he spent his final years speaking out about wrongful convictions, about the failures of the justice system, about the importance of never giving up on the truth. At his funeral, I was asked to speak. I told everyone about the man I'd once thought was my sister's killer, the man who turned out to be another of Frank Morrison's victims, the man who had endured 2 decades of imprisonment with a dignity I'm not sure I could have mustered. I told them that Carl Jennings was a hero, not because he had done anything extraordinary, but because he had survived, because he had refused to let injustice destroy his soul, because he had forgiven a world that had wronged him terribly. The day after Carl's funeral, I received a letter. It was from Rebecca Torres, the woman who had first told me about Morrison's true nature. She wrote to thank me for never giving up, for being willing to listen when no one else would. She wrote that for the first time in decades, she felt safe. She wrote that she was finally able to sleep through the night without nightmares. Her letter ended with a quote that I've been thinking about ever since. It was from Martin Luther King Jr. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." For 20 years, I wasn't sure I believed that. I'd seen so much injustice, so much suffering, so many powerful people escaping accountability while the innocent paid the price. But now, sitting on this porch, where my sister once sat, I think I understand what King meant. Justice isn't inevitable. It doesn't happen automatically. The arc bends because people push it, because they refuse to accept that wrong should go unpunished, because they keep fighting even when the fight seems hopeless. My sister bent that arc with her courage, asking questions when it would have been safer to stay silent. Carl Jennings bent it with his persistence, insisting on his innocence year after year. Karen Mitchell bent it with her terrible choice, placing truth above loyalty. And maybe, in my own small way, I bent it too. I think about Sarah every day. I think about the life she should have had, the person she would have become. I imagine her at 40 with gray starting to show in her dark hair, with laugh lines around her eyes, with a successful veterinary practice, and maybe a family of her own. I imagine her happy, fulfilled, surrounded by the love she so generously gave to everyone she met. That life was stolen from her. No verdict, no sentence, no amount of justice can change that fundamental tragedy. But her story lives on. Her courage is remembered. And the monster who killed her will spend the rest of his days in a cell, stripped of everything he valued, finally facing the consequences of his actions. There's a bench in the Hawkins Creek Cemetery now, next to Sarah's grave. It was paid for by the community, by people who remembered my sister and wanted to honor her memory. The inscription on the bench reads, "For Sarah Elizabeth Mercer, 1986, 2003. She asked the questions that needed to be asked. She shone a light in the darkness. She is not forgotten." I visit that bench every week. I sit there and talk to my sister, tell her about my life, about the world that's changed so much since she left it. I tell her about the friends I've made, the peace I've finally found, the future I'm learning to embrace. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the Tennessee hills, I swear I can hear her voice. Not the frightened voice of my nightmares, not the voice crying out for help that never came, but the voice I remember from childhood, laughing and teasing and full of life. She's at peace now. And finally, after 20 years, so am I. This story began with a disappearance, a community's trust betrayed, a justice system corrupted beyond recognition. It could have ended in despair, in unanswered questions, in a killer who escaped forever. But it didn't end that way. It ended with truth revealed, with the guilty punished, with a sister remembered and honored. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, I want to thank you. Not just for watching, but for bearing witness, for caring about Sarah and Carl, and all the other victims whose names I've spoken, for understanding that these aren't just stories, they're lives, real lives, that deserve to be remembered. If this story moved you, share it. Share it so that others know what happened in Hawkins Creek, Tennessee. Share it so that other families with missing loved ones know they're not alone. Share it so that those who abuse their power understand they will eventually face consequences. And if you have a story of your own, a loss you've never fully processed, a truth you've been afraid to pursue, don't give up. The road is long and the obstacles are many, but justice is possible. Resolution is possible. Peace is possible. My sister taught me that, and now I'm teaching it to you. For Sarah, for all of them, for everyone who deserves the truth. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring, and thank you for remembering. The arc of the moral universe is long, but we bend it together.